The lines between protecting democracy and undermining it have become dangerously blurred. For years, we've heard warnings about threats to our democratic system. The loudest of these centered on Donald Trump, portrayed by his opponents as an existential danger to the republic. But as we dive into the events leading up to the 2024 election, we're forced to ask, in their zeal to protect democracy, have its self-proclaimed defenders become the very threat they feared? Let's start with the legal challenges facing Donald Trump. The former president and current candidate is battling a barrage of indictments spanning multiple jurisdictions. He's charged with falsifying business records related to hush money payments in New York. Federal prosecutors have indicted him for mishandling classified documents after leaving office. Georgia has brought charges related to attempts to overturn the state's 2020 election results. And another federal case focuses on his actions surrounding the January 6th Capitol riot. Supporters of these prosecutions argue that no one is above the law, not even a former president. They say these charges reflect serious crimes that threaten the foundations of our democracy. But critics see a different picture. They argue that these indictments are politically motivated, designed to derail Trump's campaign rather than seek justice. They point to the timing of the charges and the nature of criminally prosecuting a former president and current candidate. But the legal challenges don't stop there. In a move unlike any in American history, there have been attempts to remove Trump from the ballot in multiple states. These efforts, based on interpretations of the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause, raise serious questions about the role of courts and state officials in determining ballot access for major candidates. Critics argue this sets a dangerous precedent for using legal maneuvers to sideline political opponents. However, the controversy doesn't stop with Trump. The Democratic side has seen its own share of questionable moves. It all started with Joe Biden's poor performance in a stress test presidential debate that went horribly wrong for Joe Biden. His poor performance set off alarm bells among party insiders, bringing long whispered concerns about his cognitive fitness to the forefront. What happened next was truly extraordinary. Reports suggest that Democratic donors and high-ranking party officials pressured Biden to step aside, wielding the threat of invoking the 25th Amendment as leverage. In a move that shocked the nation, Biden resigned his candidacy. But here's where things get really interesting. Without winning a single primary or delegate, Kamala Harris was elevated to the position of presumptive nominee. Let that sink in for a moment. The votes of nearly 15 million Democratic primary voters was effectively nullified. The party that has long championed the importance of every vote decided that, in this case, those votes didn't matter. This move raises serious questions about the party's commitment to internal democracy and the influence of party elites over the will of the electorate. But it doesn't stop there. Since her elevation to nominee, the Democratic establishment has implemented a strategy to limit Kamala Harris's public appearances and unscripted interactions. Her campaign has been characterized by limited press conferences, carefully scripted interviews, and a notable absence of town hall events. While this approach may shield Harris from potential gaffes or difficult questions, it stands in stark contrast to the principles of open dialogue and voter engagement that are cornerstones of a healthy democracy. To fully grasp the gravity of our current situation, we need to look back at the pattern of controversies that have shaped recent elections. The 2016 election saw the emergence of the Trump-Russian collusion narrative centered around the infamous Steele dossier. Funded by the Clinton campaign and the DNC, this document contained unverified claims about Trump's ties to Russia. The subsequent FBI investigation and Mueller probe cast a long shadow over Trump's campaign and early presidency, despite ultimately finding no conclusive evidence of collusion. Fast forward to the 2020 election, and we encounter the Hunter Biden laptop controversy. Just weeks before the election, the New York Post published emails allegedly found on Hunter Biden's laptop, suggesting improper business dealings involving Joe Biden. What happened next was alarming. Social media platforms restricted sharing of the story, citing concerns about misinformation. Some media outlets and former intelligence officials quickly labeled it as potential Russian disinformation. It was only after the election that the authenticity of the laptop and many of the emails was largely confirmed, raising serious questions about the handling of the story and its potential impact on the election outcome. So what does all of this mean for American democracy? The implications are far-reaching and deeply troubling. First and foremost, these actions are eroding public trust in democratic institutions. When voters perceive that the legal system can be weaponized for political gain, That major media outlets and tech companies can suppress or amplify stories based on political preferences, that party elites can override the will of primary voters, and that candidates can avoid public scrutiny. The result is a deeply cynical electorate that questions the very legitimacy of the democratic process. This erosion of trust has real-world consequences. It can lead to decreased voter turnout as people lose faith in the system. It can fuel the rise of extremist movements that position themselves as alternatives to a rigged system. It can also make it increasingly difficult to govern effectively, as large portions of the population view any actions by elected officials as illegitimate. The turmoil in the American electoral system has not gone unnoticed on the global stage either. Long seen as a beacon of democracy, the United States now faces questions about the health of its political system. This shift potentially weakens America's moral authority in promoting democracy abroad, provides ammunition for authoritarian regimes to criticize democratic systems, and may lead to decreased trust in American leadership on the global stage. Perhaps most alarmingly, these tactics set dangerous precedents that could reshape American politics for generations to come. If it becomes acceptable to use the justice system to target political opponents, override the will of primary voters, or shield candidates from public scrutiny, we risk entering a new era of American politics in which the rules of the game are fundamentally altered. When in power, each party might feel justified in using these tactics against its opponents, creating a downward spiral that could ultimately threaten the very foundations of our democratic system. So in the face of these challenges, what can we do? How can we as citizens work to preserve and strengthen our democracy? First and foremost, we need to stay informed. This means going beyond headlines and sound bites, seeking out diverse sources of information, and thinking critically about the news we consume. It means being willing to engage with perspectives different from our own, and always being open to changing our minds in the face of new evidence. We also need to be active participants in our democracy, not just passive observers. This means voting, of course, but it goes far beyond that. It means attending local government meetings, engaging in respectful political discussions with those with different views, and perhaps even running for office ourselves. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires our active involvement. We must also hold our leaders accountable. This means demanding transparency from our elected officials regardless of party affiliation. It means calling out undemocratic behavior wherever we see it, even if it's coming from politicians we generally support. And it means being willing to prioritize the health of our democratic institutions over short-term partisan gains. Education is another crucial component. We need to strengthen civic education in our schools, ensuring that all Americans understand the principles and processes of their democracy. This includes not just the mechanics of how government works, but also the critical thinking skills necessary to be informed citizens in the digital age. Finally, we need to work on rebuilding trust in our institutions, our fellow citizens, and the democratic process itself. This is perhaps the most challenging task of all, but it's essential. It starts with each of us committing to honesty, integrity, and respect in our political engagement. The 2024 election cycle is a stark reminder that democracy is not a given. It's a fragile system that requires constant nurturing and protection. The actions we've seen from both major parties raise serious questions about the state of American democracy. In our efforts to protect against perceived threats, we may unintentionally undermine the very foundations of the system we're trying to preserve. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves hard questions. Are we truly protecting democracy, or are we sacrificing its core principles for short-term political gains? Are we living up to the ideals of transparency, fairness, and the rule of law that form the bedrock of our republic? The answers to these questions will shape the future of American democracy for generations to come. It's up to all of us, voters, politicians, media figures, and civic leaders, to reflect deeply on our actions and their consequences. Only by recommitting ourselves to the core principles of democratic governance can we hope to emerge from this crisis with a stronger, more resilient democracy. The choice is ours. The future of American democracy is in our hands. Let's not let it slip away. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the state of American democracy. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread awareness about these critical issues. And remember, in a democracy, your voice matters. Use it wisely.